Hello and welcome to the wildly inconsistent Out, Then and Now, where I, AJ Carey, the comic archivist, talk about the first issue of a comic title and the latest first issue of that same title. Today we are doing a special donor request, so quick plug. If you want me to cover a Then and Now, my PayPal is linked below. $25 gets you a Then and Now. For anything else, my DMs are open on Twitter. Yes, eventually that may change, but today is not that day. I also need to give a shout out to Retrostatic Radio, the radio show remakes I co-star in, and you should listen to. There's a Ko-fi if you want to spam some cash over that way, and we may or may not be thinking about remaking the Superman radio show. That's also linked below, but is available on all major podcast platforms. And December 20th, we return with Season 2 and It's a Wonderful Life. Okay, right then, housekeeping out of the way, let's cue up the opening and dive into the October treat, out in December, Werewolf by Night. In the long history of the comic book industry, horror comics have always been a staple. From classic lit adaptations such as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to the weird menaces of mystery and crime stories, it was and is a foundation. Which is why it was one of the linchpins of the seduction of the innocent fear-mongering that hurt comic culture and even today leads to big business for those who want to spread that rhetoric. But that's its own show. Side tangent, everyone I see tries to put the roots of horror comics in with the pulp scene. While yes, pulp stories, serials, and detectives, and all of those held an air of horror. With building suspense and the occasional weird menace, horror media existed alongside that detective and mystery scene, which Werewolf by Night finds itself, so let's derail completely back onto the topic in 1953. Atlas Comics publishes Marvel Tales number 116 with a 5-page story called Werewolf by Night. It is unimportant. I wish I was joking about that, but in 1953, that was a bad time to have a horror or supernatural comic, because in the following year, the Comics Code Authority was solidified. The CCA banned cleavage, it destroyed any critical work against law enforcement, and more on topic, it banned all horror and, air quote, macabre stories from being told. Check out my Then and Now on Spectacular Spider-Man to see how there was a few workarounds to it. I swear it's good. The positive of that time period meant that an all-new Werewolf by Night feature would show up as an original idea from Roy Thomas, written by Jerry Conway, who was also the writer on my Spectacular Spider-Man, then part of Then and Now. Neat. The only reason it's called Werewolf by Night, though, was actually because of Stan Lee suggesting it, and it stuck. So Jack Russell, the Werewolf by Night, made his official debut in Marvel Spotlight number 2 in February of 1972. As was the fashion of the time, Russell was given a test storyline in Marvel Spotlight 2 through 4, and it would set up a fair point of his lore, such as his sister Lissa, his brother Philip, and the evil scientist Dr. Blackgar, although more on him later. This test run worked out, and Werewolf by Night number 1 came out towards the end of that year. Cover date is September, but the release date was in June, so take that for what it is. And that run would, run for 43 issues until 1977. But the 70s were a phenomenal time because this issued the great grand point that now the gates were breaking and the monsters could be unleashed. Jack Russell was such a good boy that he didn't have to do his own solo anymore. Right in between issues 19 and 20 in 74, he got to headline a giant-sized creature feature called Giant-Sized Creatures number 1, which also had the first appearance of Greer Nelson moving away from her cat persona to finally go by the name Tigra. It was essentially a Marvel 2-in-1 with 2 independent stories, but they were giant-sized, and it was a start since it would then relaunch as Giant-Sized Wolfman and go 4 more issues. Then there was also Marvel Premiere number 28 in 1975, which introduced the Legion of Monsters, which was Ghost Rider, Werewolf by Night, Morbius the Living Vampire, and Man-Thing. What? Comics are serious business. Now, to try and keep this from just listing off his reading orders, there are a few available online, Werewolf by Night proper didn't get a volume 2 until the 90s. But that didn't mean that the character really lay dormant in that time. Through the 80s, he popped up in Marvel Comic Presents a few different times, was a recurring character in Moon Knight, who, yes, did debut in Werewolf by Night's solo series years prior, but it was only natural that they debut the redesign for Wolfman's werewolf form in Moon Knight. For maybe the more casual fan, though, it may be surprising that he actually popped up surprisingly a lot in Spider-Woman, alongside the Darkhold, which was also introduced with Jack Russell way back in Marvel Spotlight, and it's also probably most known now for the WandaVision, Doctor Strange 2 stuff. I'd also be remiss if I didn't bring up the Doctor Strange cameos that actually led to Topaz, a long-running support character in Werewolf by Night, to actually become a recurring Strange character. Okay, so then we hit the 90s, and Jack Russell has been a support character in the Midnight Suns, especially the major storyline Midnight Massacre. Although the biggest plot point in that is probably that Blade becomes Switchblade. Yes, apparently being named Blade wasn't edgy enough, so he needed to be spring assisted. But we're here for Werewolf by Night, and Volume 2, written by Paul Jenkins, with stunning art by Leonardo Manzo? Eh. And colors by Mary Javins? Javins? And later Mariana Manso, or whatever. But regardless of the quality, these covers are just sheer fantastic by themselves. However, the story there wouldn't actually end, because that only got a 6-issue series. It would be followed up in Volume 4 of Strange Tales, issues 1 and 2. Oh, and yes, I totally forgot to bring up that the entire history, he's just called the Werewolf, not Werewolf by Night. I just like calling him Werewolf by Night. So 1998 was the last volume of the Jack Russell version of Werewolf by Night, but he would appear throughout the 2000s with a resurgence of the Legion of Monsters, and yes, naturally that resurgence ties in with the Frankencastle comics storyline thing, but that deserves its own video, and I doubt even most of my listeners actually remember or know about Frankencastle. Oh, and Werewolf did get a 4-part series with Dead of Night featuring Werewolf by Night number 1 through 4 in 2009 by Dwayne Straczynski and Miko Swayan. I am not good with names. It's part of the Max imprint, so it's kind of an alternate timeline. But the Max imprint was also weird because some parts of it were the 616 and other parts of it wasn't, and that is its own thing. And of course, in the 2000s, Nina Price, Jack's niece, and inheritor of the werewolf curse from the Darkhold, got bit by a vampire, you see. So instead of becoming a storyline from Werewolf Diaries, Klaus fans represent, she actually became the Vampire by Night. A were-vampire, as it were. And she joins Nick Fury's Howling Commandos around that time when they were all monsters. And then we get to the 2010s, where he'd become a recurring character mostly in Deadpool's litany of comics, most notably during the Dracula's Gauntlet story, where Deadpool pisses off Dracula by having his fiancée fall in love with him instead, so Dracula essentially gets every Marvel monster to attack Deadpool. Yes, Deadpool shoots him in the head. Jack gets better. We totally swear. There's also a really good X Factor storyline dealing with Wolfbane about to give birth, and he comes to kinda sorta help. God, I miss X Factor investigations. Anyways, the last 2 pages of script means nothing, because 2020 is the next official Werewolf by Night, and that would see the debut of a whole new werewolf, Jake Gomez. Jake's actually popped up as the current werewolf in 2021's Crypt of Shadows to face off against Moon Knight, but that splendid Jack Russell return in Moon Knight Annual number 1 from Jed MacKay's current run is also really righteous. And a comic I covered on Then and Now a couple episodes ago or several months ago, depending on how you want to look at it. Link is in the description. Man, I really miss annotations. So there's the abridged to high hell version of the Werewolf by Night title and lead character. So now let's actually hop all the way back to September of 1972, or June of 72, with the very first issue of the very first solo series. 1972. Black September caused a bad time at the Olympics. Britain suspends the provincial government of Northern Ireland to take direct control. And of course, Nixon visits China thanks to ping pong. It was the perfect year for a horror revival. This is Werewolf by Night number 1, written by Jerry Conway, pencils by Pike Plug, inks by Frank Ciaramonti, and letters by John Costanza. We begin with Jack Russell already having been turned to stone. Yeah, I know that's one of the major problems with characters introduced elsewhere, especially in the 70s and 80s, where getting your own solo book meant something. But hey, them's the breaks, and since he's a thinking stone statue, we can actually get some recaps for what happened in Marvel Spotlight. To sum up, Jack came to the private island of Miles Blackguard to try and get back the evil magical book, the Darkhold, so he could break his family's ancestral werewolf curse. And for funsies, Miles Blackguard also bought and moved Jack's dad's ancestral castle to this little island off the coast of California, because that's what rational people with Bezos levels money does. And Miles Blackguard's daughter is actually a mutant Gorgon, not to be confused with the mutant Gorgon, or the Inhumans Gorgon. And being a Gorgon, she's able to use her cool, glowy eyes to turn Jack into a statue, where he is now. Luckily for him, this is the first issue of his ongoing series, so when the sun starts to rise, the spells wears off as he transforms back into a squishy human. A little later, after a forced nap, his friend Buck Cohen finds him, and even though Jack's barely able to walk, they both go back to the house to find the Darkhold. Since no one's guarding it, they get Darkhold in like the next panel, but the Blackguard, elderly Miles in his chair, and Marlene, his Gorgon daughter, in a stylishly tasteful pink and yellow tunic, leggings number, are already rallying to find the book that just got stolen. Jack and Buck race off to their seaplane and escape without any incident. Magical. And then finally, Jack can fill in Buck about everything that's gone on. Unfortunately, if you bought this issue on spec way back when, we, the audience, don't actually get to hear the story, only that Jack left out the parts where he turns into a werewolf. As for the Darkhold, Jack can't read Latin, so that is a bit of a bust. Buck, however, does try to help since apparently he studied classical literature, and we do actually get a bit of a hint as to Jack's family life and dynamic when he brings up his real father and then his stepfather, who was actually the one who sold the castle to Miles Blackguard after Jack's mom died. Speaking of family, Jack actually remembers he has a sister, Lissa, who he calls to check on. She tells him he needs to come over to talk since he's been gone so long, and then there's the ominous shadow of someone on her wall as she tells him everything's fine and hangs up. After the phone hangs up, though, we do stick with Lissa, who's actually in a room with her stepfather and the Blackguards, who plan to use Lissa to get the Darkhold back. Yet that doesn't really stop the Blackguards from sending their freaky strong guy, Strug, to Jack's apartment first. Basically, it's a good way to knock out Buck for the big climax and to hold a gun to Lissa's head for the "I was forced to help" moment. Buck and Lissa get tied up and Jack gets knocked unconscious until nightfall. Feeling the change come on, he knocks Miles into Strug, then shoves past Marlene, and leaves his pleading friends and family there as he escapes into the night. Rushing to the woods, he transforms. I do understand that this art style is not as visceral as what we're kind of used to when it comes to transformations, but the simplicity and pathos of the narration around it works so much for me. Another in the long history of panels I need poster size and to put on my wall. Now that Jack's a hairy boy, Jack circles back to the apartment and attacks. It is a total slobber knocker between him and Strug, but Marlene draws her gun and fires into the two as they fight. The bullets miss the Wolfman, hitting the strongman Strug, who gets a sort of poignant death scene as he slumps to the ground. Yeah, it's not a good look for Marlene, but she doesn't care and takes off her glasses to give Jack a heavy dose of stoner eyes. Yet, faster than you can say, "Dude, there's a mirror in the shapeless background behind him, you moron," both Miles and Marlene are turned to stone, thanks to it reflecting off that mirror in the shapeless background behind Jack. That story actually wrapped itself up really quickly. Okay, it's not actually wrapped up yet, since Buck and Lissa are still tied up and unconscious. However, as the werewolf approaches, Lissa wakes up and naturally just screams her little girly head off, causing the feral Jack to run away. He runs back to the woods where his animal instincts continue to pull him in different directions, and the narration really ramps up that I am and am not the monster kind of thing. In the morning, though, Jack Russell walks out of the woods, unsure of what transpired in his feral form, and terrified of what the future holds for him. And to really wrap everything up, Buck donates the Blackguard statues now to the Santa Monica Art Museum. That is definitely one way to support the arts, kids. Now, it is very easy to say that this is actually a very unfair issue 1, since it is essentially wrapping up the story from Marvel Spotlight. But that was kind of how it worked back then, for the most part. However, I think that's also part of the strength of this issue. While it could be considered in media res, it isn't the plot that's interesting. It's the character work. Jack Russell has a drive, and the split between his thoughts as a man and the feral brain of his as a wolf leads to a great starting point to understand where we're going forward with the character. And while I am reading this from the omnibus, so the art is a bit more crisp and restored, it is still just as engaging and worthwhile. It's awesome, and you can tell why this character lasted as long as he did since then. So yes, I love Jack Russell. But can the now, with an all-new werewolf, match it? I really should write these scripts after I read both of them, huh? 2020 seems so long ago now, doesn't it? Anyways, this is Werewolf by Night, Volume 3, Number 1, written by Taboo of the Black Eyed Peas, yes, seriously, and Benjamin Earl, pencils by Scott Eaton, inks by Scott Hanna, colors by Miroslav Mrva, and letters by Joe Sabino. And for no reason, I just want to say the best cover for this is actually the Jeffrey Vereggi cover. It's the one I have in my collection, anyways. We begin in the Arizona desert on Hopi tribal land, where, as often is the case, some drunk jackasses are hooting and hollering while trying to snipe a rabbit with a 50 cal. Because it's Arizona, what else is there to do? One of the locals and rightful owners of the land these yahoos are partying redneck style on comes to tell them to leave before the beast gets to them. The head of the group tries to wave off with some passive bigotry about how the Hopi are part of the American melting pot, so they should stop trying to be different, but before this can turn into a Twitter thread, the beast arrives. They unload on the werewolf, but boy, does he know how to stand there and take it. Yes, clearly this is more of a modern werewolf idea than the Wolfman-inspired Jack Russell. We'll get to that in the conclusion. But either way, our werewolf then attacks them and drives off the yokels without causing any bloodshed whatsoever to let them flee. Good for him. But then he turns his attention to the purple-haired girl who showed up on the dirt bike. That girl is Molly, one of his friends, and then he transforms back into the 17-year-old Jake Gomez, with the narration drawing the Ginger Snaps parallel of I'm a teen full of hormones, oh, and also a freaking monster, which I'll get to in a moment. But we quickly jump from that over to two U.S. Marshals driving through the Arizona desert to an unnamed location. The U.S. Marshals are JJ, someone who I think was created for this story, and the other one is a longtime Marvel character, Red Wolf. The modern version of Red Wolf, William Taltrees, has been around since the 70s, but really became a government agent post-Civil War, where he remade the Rangers team, and now he's a U.S. Marshal hunting down kids during the Outlawed event. Outlawed was the 2020 event that was essentially Civil War Junior, where there was an age restriction put on superpowers, so the government outlawed teens and kid heroes. It wasn't necessarily a bad comic, and I will probably do an overview for it with reader's history eventually. And that's actually where our US Marshals are. They're hunting down a super teen named Pathmind, mostly so we could get a quick action beat, and they drop him to arrest him, with Red Wolf narrating and talking just the most must be wise spirit. That's when they get the call to go after the Hopi werewolf boy, but not before doing the most Californian thing ever and saying that they need to get some In-N-Out burger first, animal style. Okay, now let's actually go back to the real leading character, Jake. And Molly are over at Mall Mart, acting as just a way to make Molly look kind of insufferable. First, she's bitching about someone buying a Y Box 1 instead of throwing a ball around with his kid, and then complaining about the list of ingredients on what they're looking at. I do think that her being overbearingly this way is on purpose, since she does do that tried and true, well, I saw it on YouTube route. Unrelated, don't forget to like and subscribe this video, and turn on the bell for notifications. Anyways, ultimately this is just to set up that Jake works at Life Pharmaceuticals. It's the same place the security guards he threw around last night are security guards for, and how Molly wants him to do the mash to them. Do the monster mash. After a bit of sassy grandma time, mostly just to bring up that she knows he's a werewolf and wants him and Molly to pop out some kids, some grandparent traits are universal, we hop to Jake over at his day job, custodial work at Life Pharma. We get the character moment of him talking with his coworker about trying to find his father's regalia online after his dad sold it for a weekend in Vegas. The real plot, though, is Jake being kind of promoted to go clean up an incident in the lab. Because when you see this scene, naturally it's custodial work. Although it does give a good backhanded racial moment where the white guy says, "Oh, natives are made of sturdier stuff, so they don't need hazmat suits." I'll get more into that sort of thing a little bit later, but I actually do like moments like this, as well as earlier when you had the redneck being all, "Oh, America's melting pot, stop being a snowflake," etc., etc., etc. Because moments like this, where it is, a backhanded racist remark, is far more in line with the real world than the over-the-top racism of Twitter's Twitter. Anyways, while he's in the lab, Jake uses all of his wolfy senses to get the layout of what happened, and more importantly, overhears that there's going to be another shipment of air quote stuff. So he definitely has a mission for himself tonight. But before we can get to that fun stuff, we need to cut over to Jake with his grandma and Molly so he can say he's nothing like his dad, because he was raised by his grandmother. But then we get a bit of a Chakotay from Voyager parable of two wolves. A mother red wolf who wants love and hugs and kindness, and a mean male gray wolf that just wants hatred and anger. And how the mother wolf was fed and given what they wanted, while the gray wolf starved because he was ignored. Something bad toxic masculinity is bad. I'm going to soapbox for a moment, I know, shocker, and say this would have worked so much better without gendering the wolves. Like what the most popular air quote origin story for this is. And yes, I use air quotes there because thanks to colonialism and a severe mistreatment, there isn't exactly the same historical archiving that European mythology has. But the original is just about two wolves inside you, and the stronger one is the one you feed. It's less guided towards attributing one with masculine and feminine because it is a universal regardless of gender. However, I know some people will say I'm digging too much into this, and I might be because to hilariously betray that story, we then see that night Molly's the one calling the shots and being the voice of conflict. Of course, the positive of that, once she sicks Jake down there, he discovers that the shipment is actually people who have been kidnapped from the res. However, the issue then ends with the arrival of three cybernetic mutates. Mutates are those mutated by external means, mutants are genetically there, sort of why Deadpool keeps being rejected from the X-Men, and nothing else. But yeah, that's the end of the issue. There is actually a lot to unpack from this issue, while also there's not a lot there. Essentially, the story of Jake is a teen werewolf who gets pulled into a plot that aligns with his activist friend's plans against a big pharmaceutical company. Shocking. And then we randomly hop to Red Wolf and JJ to give this book a reason to exist thanks to Outlawed. Now, like I said, I do actually like the passive racial politics, such as in the beginning when you had the head goon talking to Molly about needing to chill because it's all part of the American melting pot, or even the crack from management about how the natives don't need hazmat suits because they're made of sturdier stuff, despite clearly it being because they're expendable. That works to showcase a realistic level of bigotry that exists on the daily, compared to the "we don't take kindly to you people" over the top stuff that other books do. Yes, that is the one positive. Well, and the art. I actually really like Scott Eaton, Scott Hanna, and Miroslav Merva's art on this book, although it sometimes feels more like a late 2000s joint over a 2020 book. I'm just going to give it like this. This is a I want to say something book. Sometimes that works. But then you have things like the Two Wolves story, which is spurred by Jake saying he's different than his dad. Which means that story is meant to reflect why Jake didn't turn out like his dad. But by gendering the mother red wolf and adding a toxic masculinity angle to it, the story gets muddied into being, well, you're not like other boys. While also then immediately followed by Molly showing that she's eager for the conflict. She would be the gray wolf, even though, she is a female character. And it's something pointed at in every scene that she's actually in, even when they're shopping. Now, and I'm not even going to touch the Taboo's real name is Jaime Gomez, or Jamie Gomez. I assume Jaime, but that's how I've always seen it spelled, so who knows. And all his kids have J's to start their name too. and he's now created a Jake Gomez. Self-insert can be fine if done well. And here, Jake is not a bad character. The major problem is that he's actually a non-character. Yes, we get narration from him, totally, but the narration is literally being a teen hormone monster doesn't fit with his actions or interactions. He's a very guided character, just going along with the plot. Granted, all of this is one issue, so maybe he's actually had to struggle with the two wolves within him later on. Spoilers, he really doesn't. So with all that out the way, what is the conclusion I can make? These two are completely different comics, obviously. I know that's a huge no duh, but what I mean by that is that besides having two different main werewolves by night, they're going for absolutely different things. The 70s Jack Russell Werewolf by Night is a hardcore love letter and extension of the universal Wolfman motif, complete with the creepy castles, generational curses, and an evil magical grimoire. Overall, though, the character works so well because that simple want to have a Wolfman you can play with means that you can adjust and play with the genre and expand him out to being something much more than the elevator pitch. The first issue, however, does just sort of wrap up Marvel's spotlight, which does hurt it as a standalone general read. It is so much more enjoyable with the first parts of the story, but readers aren't completely lost hopping into this issue either. The new one of the 2020s is not based on Universal. Aesthetically, while it is still a generational curse, it is grounded in the more Native American experience with skinwalkers and that sort of feeling. Does it do the job, though? Insofar as that there is a lot of ideas and themes thrown into the book, nothing ever really pays off about it, at least in this issue, and spoiler, not really for the rest of the limited series. It's this weird thing where it is not bad. But for a book that throws the lycanthropy as a parallel to teen hormones, and the I am not my father, and a biracial native Mexican heritage, life on the res, evil big pharma, activist shorthand, and even the two wolves taking up a page or so. I may sound like I'm just harping on that, but on a very simple story level, that is you spelling out the theme. When you stop a story to go, here's a parable, and the parable is meant to be an analogy for the story being told in the media that it's being told in. But Jake is absolutely bland in this. And I think that's the problem with me, frankly. Jake has a lot of narration that doesn't follow through in both action or reaction to any situation. The only time he ever looks determined would be when he's talking about getting his father's regalia back off of an online reseller. And maybe that's what bummed me out most about comparing these two. I want to like the 2021 so much. I can see where the threads of a great story could be. People are disappearing off the res. That's wrapped up this issue. A mixed race teen that has discovered he's a werewolf. Not actually applicable to this story. The government sending people to hunt him because he's a powerful teen. Well, yeah, that's eventually going to come up, but we need to fight evil pharma. Evil pharmaceutical company being evil. Yep, that's a thing. Why are they evil? Well, because they're the one kidnapping people. Okay, and? Well, and they want to just mutate some people. That's basically just the page that justifies Molly's fervor to go after them. What about Molly's overenthusiasm for conflict? Awesome. That's literally the only thing that drives the narration forward. Even when Jake overhears that there's a shipment of something being delivered in a hush-hush way, it takes Molly there to go get him, boy. It is such a waste of potential. Taboo could have written his self-insert character, but there needed to be agency in the story. He wanted to set this up. He wants to set this up. The problem is the second you have your character go, I'm a freaking teen werewolf, and I'm so full of hormones for being a teen and for being a werewolf. The best way to explain this is there wants to be this, toxicity of the feral side or anything like that. And even in the very first fight we see, he only throws around the drunk guards that are shooting at people. He throws them around. There's no blood, there's no one dead, there's no one even injured to the point. So that means that he has a massive control. It's not the same as Jack Russell where the narration is leading you through his thought processes where he could have actually attacked Lissa. He wasn't in his right mind. but in the fact that you have a giant dog beast boy not hurting anyone means that he's already overcome that hormone thing that he tries bringing up after the fact. Okay, enough ranting about that. So, what is even my conclusion on this? I think the best conclusion to draw is actually about guaranteed character longevity. Hear me out. Jack Russell's Werewolf by Night began as a very simple premise. It was a single building block, essentially ripping from Universal Horror. Marvel, or Atlas, or whoever, wanted their version of the Wolfman, and creative teams expanded on the simple premise to create a long lasting character who, even without a solo title, would pop up everywhere. Yes, that did stem from high sales, allowing for the ongoing to go so long, but it was the core that grew into more that allowed for the character to be utilized to a phenomenal point. The 2020 Werewolf by Night, though, had a single trade run, and you can almost tell that they knew that they only had 6 issues to say what they wanted. So instead of building up these social topics and character beats, they should have been expanded on. It was all front loaded on the first issue and not really given proper time to simmer or grow naturally from that. It's stated as text, and that's that. Yes, it is depressing to think that creativity is hindered by limitations, but sometimes that is the largest hurdle you have to jump over. On that bombshell, though, I really never know how to end these videos, so that's it. You can all go home. And please don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Check out Retrostatic Radio, where I will be voicing George Bailey and others on December 20th for It's a Wonderful Life, and so much more over there. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and I think I may have a TikTok, but I don't even know anymore. But more than anything, though, I'm AJ Carey, the comic archivist, and you should stay golden, Inklings.